Hi everybody, Charles from GMAT Ninja Tutoring here. Today we're going to talk about bad GMAT scores. By bad, I don't mean low. I mean that terrible feeling you get when you miss only, let's say, 2 questions on a GMAT section, but you get a score that's nowhere close to perfect, let's say an 80, something like that on a section. So we see that all over the place on the internet, on gmatclub, from our private tutoring students saying, wait a minute, I missed 2, that's close to perfect. How is it that my score was so far from perfect? So in this video, we're going to explain how all that works. Why does that happen? 4 main reasons why. We'll get into all of those details. Also, keep in mind, the other side of that coin is if you can miss very few questions and get a relatively low score, you can also miss a bunch of questions and get a relatively high score, and we'll get into those details as well. Now, normally when you see me in these videos talking to myself into a camera, it's my own opinions, my own thoughts, not necessarily worth a whole lot. This video is done in very, very close collaboration with GMAC, the people who create the GMAT. So it took us about 16 months going back and forth on the content for this one. Wanted to make sure we got it right, got it accurate. We were protecting everybody's privacy. So we can't show any actual GMAT test scores. We will show practice test score reports. Those practice tests run the exact same algorithm as the actual exam. So these are going to be pretty darn close to the real thing. And we're going to show you some that look bad, some that look good, and explain how all that works. And with that, here comes some interesting scores. All right, there's no shortage of bad scores like this on the internet, but I'll give you a few examples that I think are pretty stark. So this poor fellow missed just 1 on his quant section, got an 84. Here's another good one. He missed 2 questions, just 2, got an 80, so nice long ways from a 90. Feels terrible. And this poor guy missed just 4 on data insights and didn't even get to an 80. So those are examples of scores where you look at it and go, wait a minute, I did great. I got 16 right out of 20 on a really hard section, and I didn't even get to an 80. Feels awful, feels surprising. But again, we'll get into the reasons why this can happen. Now, here comes the other side of that coin. So here's a really good score. So remember that guy who missed 1 question, got an 84 on quant? Well, this section, he missed 1 and got an 89. So here's somebody who missed 4 questions, still got an 88 on verbal. And then here's one that was kind of a mess. -9, missed almost half of the questions on data insights, still got an 80. Bottom line here is it's very, very possible to miss just a few questions, get a bad score. Other side of the coin is true as well. You can miss a whole bunch and get a really good score. And in just a moment, we'll get into the reasons why that can happen. So the first reason why your GMAT score might not quite look the way you expect it to is that the GMAT is an adaptive test, which means that which questions you miss matters just as much as how many questions you miss. So on a traditional exam, like the kind you might have taken in university or high school, you might have been getting graded solely on the percentage of questions you answered correctly. Now, as an adaptive test, that's not how the GMAT works. So the GMAT is trying to tailor the difficulty level of every question you see based on your performance up to that point. So all else being equal, if you're crushing everything in sight, doing great, you're going to see harder questions. If you're struggling, missing a lot of questions, you're going to see easier ones. And all of that's going to get wrapped up into your final score. Now, I don't mean to suggest that if you get 1 question right, that the difficulty will suddenly jump upward, or if you miss a question, it'll suddenly jump downward. There's a lot more smoothing that goes on in the algorithm, and there's a bunch of other factors that go into question selection. But the bottom line is that all else being equal, if you perform better, you're going to see harder questions. If you perform worse, you're going to see easier questions, and the difficulty level of those questions will affect your score enormously. Now, the upshot of that is that all else being equal, if you miss an easy question, it's going to hurt your score more than missing a hard question. Why is that? If you miss an easy question, the algorithm's more likely to say, we better not give you too many hard questions, and it's going to affect all of the questions that follow that miss on an easy one. So that brings us to our poor guy here with this, what he felt was a terrible outcome, missed only 1 question, so close to perfect, 20 out of 21 right, and got just an 84, long ways from perfect. So still a really good score here, but he felt terrible. Now, why did this happen? In all likelihood, that error on that 1 question was on a fairly easy question, certainly easy for him, and that disproportionately affected his score. Now, the other side of the coin to that is if you miss harder questions, your score is not going to suffer as much. So this test taker who missed 4 questions and still got an absolutely fantastic verbal score of 88, those were almost certainly tough, tough questions, and the algorithm didn't punish him so much for those. All right, so you might be saying, well, maybe those 2 are kind of weird. Maybe they're outliers. Like, how common is this really? Well, we collected some data on this. So our friends at GMAC gave you some actual data from actual test scores. So I'm just going to give you a little segment of it just to give you a sense of just how common the spread in these scores are given a certain number correct. So here's some quant scores. So imagine that you miss 5 questions on quant. What might your score look like? Well, the median, so the 50th percentile, the typical person who misses 5 on the quant section is going to get a score of 80. but at the 90th percentile. So if you're on the high side of people who missed 5, that's a score of 83. On the low side of 76, that's the 10th percentile. Now notice, we're not showing you the outliers. GMAC didn't want to do that for a number of reasons, but you can imagine that the 10% on either end might have scored even higher on the upper end, higher than 83 despite missing 5, and lower than 76, missing just 5. So huge spread here. Now, same idea if you missed just 2. Typical person's going to get an 86. Somebody in the 90th percentile would get an 88. Somebody in the 10th percentile would get an 83. But again, more outliers on either end of that. You could have people who are scoring even higher than an 88 in that upper 10% and even lower than an 83. So again, imagine that terrible feeling when you go, wait a minute, I missed only 2 and I got an 83. That's actually common. It's exactly what we expect from an adaptive test. And it's exactly the sort of thing that you see in the data. So I don't want you thinking, hey, this was an abnormality and my score must be messed up in some way. This is exactly what happens on an adaptive test. And if you're getting a lower score than you expect, odds are good that you missed something that was relatively easy for you. And if you're getting a higher score than you expect, given the number that you got wrong, odds are good you just missed some of the tougher stuff. Okay, so a second common reason why your GMAT score might be lower than you expect is omitted questions. So take this guy, for example, missed just 2 in his data insights section, felt great taking it, had been performing great up to this point, and got just an 80, which he felt was way lower than he deserved. What happened? Well, notice that he didn't even answer that last question. And the way the GMAT scoring system works, you're going to lose quite a bit if you omit questions. So typically what we see on average, you're going to lose about 3 or 4 points per omitted question, give or take a little bit depending on the section, depending on the circumstances. But think of it as a 3 to 4 point penalty roughly per omission. Bottom line here, if you're running out of time at the end of the section, just answer everything, please. You want to eliminate this as a source of disappointment. So just answer everything, don't have any omissions, and this is something you won't have to worry about. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about a reason why your score might be higher than you expect based on the number you missed, and that's research questions or experimental questions. So every good standardized exam is going to have some number of questions that don't count towards your score. These are sometimes called research questions, experimental questions, unscored questions. Basically, what the test makers are doing is they're taking a question, probably a fairly new one, dropping it into your test in a way that you can't really tell which ones are experimental and which ones actually count, and just seeing what you do, seeing how you perform. They're going to collect data on that question, find out if that question is actually good enough to be included in the exam. So those don't count towards your score. Now, we don't know exactly how many of these questions appear on the GMAT. I can say that historically on exams like the GMAT, typically we see between 15 and 30% of questions that are unscored and don't count towards your final result. Okay, so let's take an example here. So here's a practice test again. So this was the guy who missed just 1, got a fantastic 89 on his verbal, presumably missed a question that was pretty darn hard. Now, let's imagine that there are 3 experimental questions on his verbal section. And again, that's not the actual number necessarily. That's just an example. So let's imagine that there are 3. And let's imagine that it's this guy's actual exam. And remember, practice exams and the actual test run the same algorithm. The only difference between them on the GMAT is the presence of these experimental questions. So let's take this guy with his -1, 89 on verbal. And let's suppose that he misses all 3 of those experimental questions. And here's what his exam would look like in that case. He misses 4 and still gets that 89. So bottom line here is that another source of variability in your final score is these experimental questions. I don't want you worrying about them. I don't want you thinking about them. You can't figure out which ones are which. That's not a way I want you to spend your time and energy. But just be aware, if you see somebody or you yourself get a score and you go, wow, that's really high and I missed a bunch of questions, experimental questions can be a reason why that happens. Okay, the fourth and final reason why you might get a different GMAT score than you expect is in rare cases, there might be kind of an effect that comes from changing your answers at the end of a section. So as you probably know, on the GMAT, you can stop at the end of the test section. If you have some time remaining, you can go and review as many questions as you'd like, and you can change up to 3 of your previous answers. Now, when we were talking about the adaptive algorithm, if you miss easy questions fairly early in a section, questions that are easy for you, all else being equal, you're going to see easier questions throughout, and that's going to hurt your score. So what can happen in theory, and I want to emphasize this only happens in very extreme cases. Let's imagine that early in the test section, you miss a bunch of questions that are really easy for you, and then it kind of keeps the level of question pretty low from there. And let's say you never quite recover, you miss a couple questions along the way, your score in the end isn't great because you missed a bunch of easy questions. Maybe you didn't miss a ton, but the questions you missed were relatively easy, keeps your score down. Now, also imagine that you get to the end of the section, you've got some time, and you go back and you change 3 of those from wrong to right. Now, in the end, you might look at your score report and say, well, wait a minute, it's only going to show the ones I missed in the end. Maybe it's only a couple of them, but the score will be relatively low because the difficulty level was fairly easy because in part at least, of those easier questions you missed early on that you changed to right answers later. So in theory, that's very possible. In practice, I looked really, really hard for examples of this. It was really hard to find them, really hard to cook them up. The reason why, or at least one reason why GMAC decided to only let you change up to 3 answers is that if you change 3 answers, it's very, very unlikely to have that crazy effect on your scores where you're going to see something that's totally out of whack. So very, very extreme thing, doesn't happen very often. There's a lot of chatter on the internet that maybe this is a thing and somehow changing your answers is going to have weird effects on your score. In practice, the data suggests it's not really true. In extreme cases, can it look a little weird? Yeah, but it doesn't happen very often at all. And I don't want you to worry about it too much. If you have time left at the end, go ahead and edit. Do your best on your first pass through the test. And if you've got that extra time, use it. But in all likelihood, this isn't going to cause some crazy warping effect on your exam. One last thing. So much of the time when I see somebody either online or private tutoring students react to a score and go, hey, I only missed a couple questions. This score is horrible. This score is bad. A lot of the time, the score is much better than they think. Now, I understand how it feels. A perfect score is a 90. Now, that's incredibly difficult to get. So when you get something like an 80 or an 82 or a 78 on a section, that might feel really low to you. But I want you to think about, maybe that score is good enough for me to get into my target programs, and maybe it's fantastic. 80 is a really good score on all 3 sections. And we see people every day getting into elite MBA programs with scores right around that range, right around that 80, sometimes on all 3 sections. So whatever you do, if you're reacting to a score and saying this is awful, please check out the averages at your target programs. Maybe what you have that you feel terrible about is plenty to get into your target programs. All right, with that, if you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. Please subscribe to this channel. And if you want to see anything else addressed in future videos with GMAC, please let us know in the comments. All right, thanks everybody. See you next time.